The air in the town of Astoria, Oregon was thin and cold on a morning in the fall of 2020. Red and yellow maple leaves fell gently, blanketing the damp asphalt road. The familiar scent of roasted coffee from the Remembrance Cafe mingled with the fragrance of pine wood and morning mist, creating a breathtaking sense of tranquility. This was a peaceful town, yet somewhere the emptiness of the pandemic still lingered, etched onto the silently closed glass windows of a few small shops. For Ethan Riley, a 28-year-old mail carrier, it was a workday like any other. His slender frame and deep brown eyes always held a pensive look, as if gazing into a different world. His dark brown hair was neatly cut, but it couldn't hide the loneliness that had been deeply etched onto his face. Ethan lived alone in a small apartment. He had no siblings, and his parents had died in a car accident many years prior. That emptiness had become a part of him, silently following him every day. The job of a mail carrier to many is a tedious repetition. But for Ethan, it was a world. He didn't just sort and deliver mail. He observed life through the envelopes. Every letter was a story. He recognized the breakdown of a family through the arguments in letters sent back and forth. Knew the longing of an old woman when she saw a letter from her distant grandchildren, or felt the happiness of a young couple through the wedding invitations sent far and wide. Ethan became a silent observer, an outsider in the play of life. He walked past each house carrying pieces of others' emotions, while his own heart remained empty. This loneliness had created a special sensitivity in Ethan. He could feel the weight of each envelope not by its physical mass, but by the emotion it contained. And it was this very sensitivity that on that particular morning led him to something unexpected. In the cold sorting room, filled with high wooden shelves, Ethan was reorganizing old letters that were past due or had an unclear address. This task was usually done on weekends when everyone else was resting. He flipped through each envelope, seeing hurried handwriting and old stamps until his hand stopped at a special one. The envelope was yellowed, the glue had hardened and showed signs of wear. The recipient's address was blank. The sender's address was blurred by an old coffee stain, creating a mottled brown streak. The coffee stain was like a metaphor for an old forgotten story that still existed. According to procedure, he should have immediately discarded this letter. But a strange intuition held his hand back. There was something in this envelope, an invisible weight that compelled him. Curiosity, and more than that, empathy, urged him to go against the rules. Ethan took a paper cutter, the blade gliding lightly along the edge of the envelope. His heart beat a little faster, a mix of guilt and excitement. He knew he was doing something forbidden, but the desire to touch a story, to connect with an emotion, won out. He pulled out a piece of yellowed paper. The handwriting on it was shaky, as if written in a state of extreme emotion. There were only a few short lines. "I am sorry for leaving you behind. That mistake has haunted me my whole life. If I could go back, I would do anything to fix it. I am sorry, my brother." These few lines were not just an apology, but a scream of regret. Ethan felt the pain in every word. He saw this man living in a prison of his own making, weighed down by obsession and guilt for many years. Ethan, who always longed for family affection, suddenly felt a strange connection to the letter. The loneliness of the sender seemed to reflect his own. Ethan placed the letter on the table, staring at it. He thought about his own parents, about the words that were never said, about the chances for reconciliation that were forever lost. He wondered if he had the opportunity, what could he have done to reconnect them? Then a powerful thought surged in Ethan's mind. The decision to find the sender of the letter was no longer mere curiosity. It had become a mission. He believed that if he helped them find each other, he would also be redeeming himself, healing a part of his own empty heart. Somehow he believed this was a way for him to become an insider someone who could create connections instead of just observing them. Ethan hid the letter in his jacket pocket. He looked out the window where the leaves were still falling. A new, unannounced journey had begun. It wasn't a journey to deliver mail, but a journey to bring two hearts together. And it was also a journey for Ethan to find meaning in his own life. Ethan held the letter, feeling an unusual restlessness. After work, instead of returning to his small apartment, he drove his old mail truck toward the outskirts of town. He knew he was embarking on an aimless journey, a journey based on just a few smudged lines on an envelope. The coffee stain had erased most of the sender's address, leaving only a few scattered numbers and letters. But these small details were a whole world to Ethan. He recognized the letter E and the number 5 at the beginning of the address, along with traces of the word street at the end. Using his knowledge of the town's geography and familiar streets, Ethan narrowed down his search to an old section of Astoria with streets that started with the letter E. His first stop was an old neighborhood where the wooden houses had faded with time. Ethan got out of his truck, feeling the aged and silent atmosphere of the place. He came to a small cafe on the corner with a weathered wooden sign that read, Remembrance. The name itself seemed like an act of destiny. Inside, the scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the cozy space. The owner was a white-haired old woman with a kind face and sharp eyes named Sarah. She was slowly but carefully wiping down the counter. Ethan hesitated before walking in, ordering a cup of coffee, and starting a conversation. "Hello, have you lived here long?" Sarah smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "My whole life, young man. I've watched this town change bit by bit." Ethan took out the old envelope. "Could you help me? I'm looking for the person who sent this letter, but the address is smudged." Sarah put on her reading glasses, took the envelope, and looked at it intently. She turned it over, and a thoughtful expression gradually appeared on her face. "This envelope feels familiar, but it's been a long time." She took a sip of her tea, her eyes gazing toward the window as if trying to retrieve an old memory. "Ah, I remember now. There was a family who lived in the house at the end of this street more than 20 years ago." Sarah told Ethan about the family, a carpenter father, a gentle mother, and 2 sons who were always close. Sarah vividly remembered the mother's handwriting because she often sent letters asking about her health. But it was not the handwriting on the letter. She then recalled that the father had a small notebook for his notes. This detail unexpectedly provided an important clue. The handwriting on the letter might belong to the father. This stunned Ethan. If it was the father, who was he apologizing to? Did the father write this letter to his son? Ethan asked for more details about the family. Sarah sighed. They were a happy family, but then a tragedy happened. A fire took the lives of both parents. The 2 children were lucky to survive, but afterward they moved away, and no one has heard from them since. Hearing Sarah's story, Ethan's heart tightened once again. He felt the pain of loss those children had to endure, and he also felt the helplessness of the father, if he was the one who wrote the letter. Ethan felt he was getting closer to a buried secret. He wasn't just searching for a person. He was trying to revive a memory, a forgotten story. His own loneliness seemed to be merging with the loneliness of the people in this story. He no longer felt like an outsider, but a part of them. Sarah pointed to an old photo hanging on the wall taken of the neighborhood on a holiday. Ethan recognized a house that had been burned, its walls a sooty black. The house stood silently, a mute testimony to a tragedy. Sarah said, "That's all I know. But if you want to know more, you should go to the town library. Mrs. Eleanor there might have some old newspaper articles." Sarah's suggestion was like a beacon in the darkness. Ethan thanked her, leaving the cafe with a greater sense of determination. The next day, Ethan went to the town library. It was an old building filled with the scent of paper and the dust of time. Mrs. Eleanor, a stern but kind woman, was organizing books. Ethan told her his story, and she nodded and listened. "I remember that fire," she said, her voice deep and warm. "It was one of the saddest stories in our town." She handed Ethan an old yellowed and frayed folder. They were copies of local newspaper articles from 20 years ago. Ethan flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. He found an article with a large headline, "Two boys saved from a horrific fire, parents perish." The article clearly stated the names of the two brothers, Daniel, the older brother 10, and Jacob, the younger brother 5. A black and white photo accompanied it, showing the two boys standing outside the burned-out house, their faces covered in soot and fear. The article wrote that the older brother Daniel bravely saved his younger brother from the fire. But afterward, they were separated. The article did not specify why. A chilling sensation ran down Ethan's spine. The letter was not from the father to the son, but from the older brother to the younger one. But why was it an apology letter? And why were they separated after they had survived the tragedy together? This story held a more heartbreaking secret than he had imagined. Ethan realized that this letter was not just a simple apology. It was the words of a brother haunted by some mistake, a mistake that had pushed the two brothers apart. His own loneliness, his longing for family affection, suddenly intertwined with the pain of Daniel and Jacob. Ethan felt a heavier responsibility than ever before. He couldn't stop now. He had to find the truth. Mrs. Eleanor, with a look of understanding, said to Ethan, "If you want to find out more, you could try the cemetery. There might be something on their parents' tombstones." That suggestion was like a glimmer of light in the darkness, urging Ethan to continue his journey. He believed that nothing was a coincidence, that everything had been arranged for him, a lonely mail carrier, to be the one to connect the broken pieces of a family. Mrs. Eleanor's suggestion echoed in Ethan's mind. The cemetery. It was the final resting place for the fragments of that family's memory. To many, a cemetery is a place of endings, of permanent separation. But for Ethan, it was a place of hope, a place where he believed he could find the answer to a secret buried for over 2 decades. Ethan drove to the town cemetery, a quiet and solemn place filled with ancient oak trees and moss-covered gravestones. The smell of damp earth and wild chrysanthemums lingered in the chilly air. Ethan walked among the rows of graves, his eyes searching. He felt a strange connection to this place. Each tombstone was a story, a life that had once existed. He no longer felt alone, but as if he was walking alongside thousands of other lives, all of them telling their stories. Finally, he found it. A simple weathered gravestone with a few cracks. The names carved on it were Matthew and Sarah Miller, with a death date exactly 20 years ago, matching the time of the fire. Below, a small faded line of text was almost illegible. "Don't forget each other. Don't forget the promise." That line was like a sacred message, an invisible thread connecting the two brothers Daniel and Jacob. It made Ethan's throat tighten. Clearly, that promise had been broken, and that could be the cause of all the pain. Ethan found the groundskeeper, an old man with a wrinkled face and gray hair, tending to the flower beds. His name was George. After hearing Ethan's story, Mr. George grew pensive, his eyes distant as if rewinding an old film. "I remember that incident clearly," he said in a hoarse voice. "I was here a short distance from this cemetery, and I saw the flames rise." Mr. George told a story that no one else in town knew, a story only he and a few others had witnessed. After the fire, the two boys were taken to a shelter. That night, Daniel, the 10-year-old boy, in a state of panic and shock, blurted out that Jacob, his 5-year-old brother, was to blame. He sobbed and said that Jacob had accidentally knocked over a candle, causing the fire. Those words were like daggers to Jacob's young heart. In reality, the fire started from an old electrical wire, Mr. George continued. The father knew about it and had intended to fix it, but he kept putting it off. However, after the incident, Daniel's accusations led everyone to believe that Jacob was the cause. The boy was too scared and too young to defend himself. Ethan was stunned. He had found the answer to the secret. The letter was not an apology for abandonment, but an apology for a lie, a cruel accusation that had haunted Daniel for 20 years. Daniel, at age 10 in a state of shock, had chosen to protect himself inadvertently, pushing his younger brother into a wrongful belief. Afterward, the two brothers were adopted by different families. Daniel had lived with that guilt, while Jacob lived with the belief that he had been abandoned by his own brother. Ethan felt Daniel's pain, the pain of a child facing a tragedy too great to bear the pain, of a brother who had unintentionally hurt the sibling he loved most. He also understood Jacob's loneliness, a child who had to grow up without a family, without a brother with an unspeakable emotional wound. He was no longer just a searcher, but a witness, someone who bore a part of their pain. Mr. George looked at Ethan with an empathetic gaze. "You're doing the right thing. There are some wounds that time cannot heal. Only truth and forgiveness can." It was getting late, and the last golden rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Ethan left the cemetery carrying a heavy truth in his heart. He had the sender's name, Daniel, but he had not yet found Jacob, the younger brother. He had to do something not just to help them find each other, but to help them heal. Back at his apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, thinking about the two brothers' story. Their pain was a mirror reflecting his own loneliness. He realized that it was precisely because he didn't have a family, didn't have siblings, that he yearned to connect them. He wanted them to have what he had lost. With the clues he had, Ethan began his search for Jacob. He went to the local records office. Ethan had to use every possible reason, from searching for information about a lost relative to pretending to be a researcher. Finally, with persistence, he found Jacob's adoption file. The boy's new name was Jacob Miller, and his current address was in a small town not far away. He had become a wood craftsman. Ethan felt a sense of relief and excitement. He had found them. He had gone through every piece of the story, from the old envelope to the cafe, the library, and now the records. Everything was gradually becoming clear. Ethan knew his journey was about to end, and a new chapter of the story was waiting. He believed that healing would come, not just for the two brothers, but for himself as well, a person who had found the meaning of life by connecting wounded hearts. The truth, Mr. George revealed, shook Ethan's entire assumptions. The story was not just about a brother who had abandoned his sibling, but about a child who had unintentionally caused an indelible emotional wound to his brother. Daniel's pain was not the regret of a selfish act, but the torment of a 10-year-old boy burdened with heavy guilt. Ethan felt a deeper empathy than ever before. He realized that Daniel's loneliness was similar to his own. They both lived with invisible scars that no one could see. It was getting late, and the last rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long streaks of light on the ground. Ethan left the cemetery carrying a heavy truth in his heart. He had the sender's name, Daniel, but he still hadn't found Jacob, the younger brother. He had to do something not just to help them find each other, but to help them heal. This story had gone beyond the limits of a simple task. It had become Ethan's personal mission. Back in his small apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, thinking about the two brothers' story. Their pain was a mirror reflecting his own loneliness. He thought about his parents, about the brief moments of happiness that had faded away. He realized that it was precisely because he didn't have a brother, a sister, that he yearned to connect them. He wanted them to have what he had lost. With the clues he had, Ethan began his search for Jacob. He knew that finding someone after 20 years would not be easy, but he was not discouraged. He went to the local records office, which held the most important information about the town's residents. Ethan had to use every possible reason, from searching for information about a lost relative to pretending to be a local history researcher. After many hours of searching through old files, Ethan found what he was looking for. An adoption file that had been sealed, but with persistence and a bit of luck, he persuaded the old librarian to open it. The boy's new name was Jacob Miller. Ethan was stunned to see that Jacob's middle name was Riley, his own last name. It was a strange coincidence, as if an invisible destiny had connected him to this story. The file stated that Jacob had been adopted by a family of carpenters. He had followed in his adoptive father's footsteps and become a master woodworker. His address was a small town not far from Astoria. Ethan felt a sense of relief and excitement. He had found them. He had gone through every piece of the story, from the old envelope to the cafe, the library, the cemetery, and now the records. Everything was gradually becoming clear. Ethan knew his journey was about to end, and a new chapter of the story was waiting. He believed that healing would come not just for the two brothers, but also for himself, a person who had found the meaning of life by connecting wounded hearts. Before meeting Jacob, Ethan went to Daniel's address. He found Daniel a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face. He was sitting on an old wooden chair, staring pensively out the window. Ethan introduced himself as a mail carrier, but Daniel only nodded vaguely. "I've come to give you a letter," Ethan said, taking out the old letter. Daniel saw the envelope, and his eyes welled up with tears. "It's been 20 years," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's been 20 years, young man. I still can't forget." Daniel told Ethan the story from his perspective. He had lived with the torment for 20 years, unable to forgive himself for blaming his brother. He had tried to find Jacob, but life had taken him far away, and all his efforts had failed. The letter he sent was not in the hope that Jacob would receive it, but simply to relieve some of the burden that had been weighing on him for so long. It was a letter to the past, a belated apology to himself. Ethan looked at Daniel, his heart heavy. He understood that not only Jacob, but Daniel himself was a victim. He had lived a life filled with pain and regret. Ethan decided not to tell Daniel about Jacob. He wanted their reunion to be special, to be a surprise. Before leaving, Ethan said to Daniel, "I believe that everything happens for a reason, and there are some wounds that only time and forgiveness can heal." Daniel looked at Ethan, his eyes full of gratitude. He believed that Ethan was not just a mail carrier, but a messenger of hope. Ethan left a strong conviction rising in his heart. He knew he had enough pieces to complete this puzzle. He had Daniel and Jacob's story. He had the apology letter, and now he would go to meet Jacob. He believed that this story would have a beautiful ending, an ending that both brothers and Ethan himself deserved. The next morning, the sun rose high, casting warm rays through the window of the mail truck. Ethan drove to the small town where Jacob lived, his heart filled with a mixture of emotions. He was excited, but also anxious. He didn't know how Jacob would react to a truth that had been buried for 20 years. Ethan felt he was carrying a heavy mission, a fragile bridge between two brothers who had been separated for too long. The town appeared before Ethan's eyes, a peaceful place with charming wooden houses, gardens full of flowers, and the fresh air of the countryside. Ethan found Jacob's address and stopped his truck in front of a small woodworking shop with a simple sign that read, "Jacob's Woodworks." The shop was nestled behind a small house with the scent of sandalwood and sawdust lingering in the air. Ethan stepped into the shop where a man was working intently. It was Jacob. He had a tall stature, a calm face, and deep brown eyes that held a sadness Ethan had seen in Daniel. Jacob was meticulously carving a block of oak wood, the grain twisting under his hands, transforming into a work of art. Around him were exquisite wooden items, from old armchairs to small jewelry boxes. Ethan stood silently observing for a while. He felt a strange connection to Jacob, not because they shared a middle name in the records, but because he could see the deep-seated loneliness in this artisan's soul. Although he was surrounded by beautiful works of art, there was still an invisible void somewhere within him. Jacob looked up, saw Ethan, and offered a forced smile. "Hello. What can I do for you?" Ethan introduced himself as an admirer of woodworking and said he wanted to commission a piece. He didn't want to rush the truth. He wanted to understand Jacob better first. "Your work is beautiful," Ethan said, his eyes resting on a half-finished wooden box on the table. Jacob smiled sadly. "Thank you. This is a gift I'm making for someone, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to give it to them." Ethan asked, "Who are you making it for?" Jacob looked at the wooden box, his voice growing softer. "My brother. We were separated when we were children. I always thought he abandoned me. But now I just want to make a gift to show my forgiveness, if I can ever find him." Ethan's state of mind became incredibly complex. He felt like he was watching a play where he already knew the ending. Jacob was living in quiet pain, believing he had been abandoned. Meanwhile, Daniel was living with the torment of his past words. Both were victims of a misunderstanding. This misunderstanding had created an invisible void between the two brothers, a wound they had tried to fill in different ways. Jacob with his woodworking, Daniel with apologies that were never sent. Ethan decided this was the time to reveal the truth. He took the old letter from his jacket pocket and placed it on Jacob's workbench next to the unfinished wooden box. "I think this belongs to you." Jacob looked at the letter, his eyes wide. How do you have this?" Ethan recounted the entire story. He had found the letter at the post office, gone to Sarah's cafe, Eleanor's library, the town cemetery, and finally, the adoption records. Ethan spoke slowly, full of empathy, leaving out no detail. He told him about Daniel's apologies, about the torment of 20 years, and the pain of a 10-year-old boy who had to bear a guilt that wasn't his. Jacob listened, his face shifting from surprise to shock, and then he broke down. He held the letter, his hands trembling, turning over each yellowed page. He read the short lines over and over, lines that contained all his brother's emotions. Jacob's tears began to fall, wetting the words on the paper. He no longer felt angry or resentful. Instead, there was immense regret. He had believed his brother had abandoned him. He had carried a silent resentment in his heart for 20 years. Now he realized that his brother had also been living in a similar pain. He had wasted 20 years believing a false truth. His tears were not of sadness, but of release, of forgiveness, and of regret. Ethan stood there quietly, giving Jacob a moment to process his emotions. He knew these moments were sacred, and that only Jacob could experience them alone. After a while, Jacob looked up, his eyes red, but his face much more serene. He looked at Ethan, his gaze full of gratitude. "Thank you. You didn't just bring me this letter. You brought me the truth. You helped me find my brother." Ethan smiled. "We'll find him." Ethan helped Jacob contact Daniel. Their reunion was arranged at the very post office where Daniel had sent the letter. Both Daniel and Jacob agreed. They wanted to return to where the story began, to bring it to a full and complete close. The next day, at the small post office in Astoria, Daniel stood waiting, his heart restless. He hadn't slept all night. He wondered, would Jacob forgive him? Would Jacob even recognize him after 20 years? A small truck pulled up. Jacob stepped out, his eyes searching. He saw Daniel, who was much thinner, his hair gray, but there was still something very familiar about him. The pain and torment had etched deep into his face, making him look much older than his age. Jacob walked quickly toward Daniel. There were no flowery words, no long questions. Just a hug. A hug that contained all their emotions. A hug of regret, of forgiveness, of love, and of loss. Jacob hugged Daniel tightly, tears falling once again. Ethan stood in a hidden corner watching silently. He felt a strange happiness. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had connected two separated people. He had helped them heal their wounds. And most importantly, he had found meaning in his own life. He was no longer an observer. He had become an integral part of this story. Their fateful meeting was also his fateful meeting with a higher purpose in life. Ethan stood quietly in a hidden corner of the post office, giving the sacred space to the two brothers. From where he stood, he could clearly see the emotional reunion of Daniel and Jacob. There were no flowery words or long explanations. There was only a hug filled with the emotions they had waited for 20 years. That hug was not just for healing their wounds, but for liberating their souls from the chains of guilt and resentment. Jacob held Daniel tightly, his tears falling uncontrollably. Those tears were not of sadness, but of release, of forgiveness, and of love. He had lived for 20 years believing that his brother had abandoned him. But now he knew it was just a heartbreaking misunderstanding, a mistake of a 10-year-old boy in a state of panic and shock. He felt immense regret for not trusting his brother's love. Daniel also held Jacob tightly, his hands trembling. For 20 years he had lived with the guilt, believing he had ruined his brother's life. He had sent that letter, not in the hope that Jacob would receive it, but simply to release some of the burden that had weighed on him for so long. But now with Jacob right in front of him, he knew that everything happened for a reason. That letter had found the right person at the right time, and the one who brought it was an angel. Ethan watched them silently, feeling a strange peace in his heart. He had fulfilled his mission. He had connected two separated people, mended a broken family. He was no longer an outsider. He had become an essential part of this story. The reunion of Daniel and Jacob was not just the reunion of two brothers, but the rebirth of faith, of hope in forgiveness and love. After a moment, Jacob released Daniel, but held onto his hand. He looked into his brother's eyes that were etched with time and pain. "Brother, I'm sorry," Jacob said, his voice choked with emotion. "I misunderstood you for 20 years. I'm sorry I didn't have faith in you." Daniel shook his head, his own tears falling. "No, Jacob, I'm the one who should be sorry. I said things I shouldn't have said. I blamed you. I've lived with the torment for 20 years. I'm the one to blame." The two brothers hugged again, this time even tighter. They no longer apologized or blamed each other. They just held each other, letting their tears mingle. Ethan knew that they had forgiven each other, and more importantly, they had forgiven themselves. Afterward, Jacob and Daniel turned to look at Ethan, their eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," Jacob said. "Without you, we might never have found each other." Daniel took Ethan's hand, his voice trembling. "Thank you. You've done something great. You've brought us a miracle." Ethan smiled. "It was nothing. I'm just a mail carrier doing my job." But in his heart, Ethan knew he had done much more than that. He hadn't just delivered a letter. He had delivered hope, truth, and forgiveness. He had found meaning in his life by connecting wounded hearts. He had found a family, a spiritual family, in this very story. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his job. But now his work held a completely different meaning. He was no longer a simple mail carrier, but a connector of hearts. He no longer felt lonely. He knew that every letter he held with or without an address contained a story, an emotion, and he was the one who could help those stories be told and those emotions be connected. Ethan's life from a silent observer had become a creator, a bringer of hope. The ending of this story was not just the reunion of Daniel and Jacob, but the rebirth of Ethan himself. He had found his purpose in life. He had found a family, a place to belong within the very stories he helped mend. He had realized that loneliness is not a fate, but an opportunity to find deeper connections and more genuine affection. And that was the greatest thing he had learned from the unclaimed letter. After the tearful reunion at the post office, Daniel and Jacob's lives began a new chapter. The emotional wounds from 20 years of separation couldn't heal immediately, but the truth and forgiveness had begun their work. They were no longer two strangers, but a family once again. They started meeting more often, reminiscing about their childhood memories. Jacob told Daniel about his life, his woodworking career, and his happy small family. Daniel in turn opened up about his lonely and tormented years, about the sleepless nights caused by guilt. Both learned to listen and share, mending the broken pieces of their souls. Jacob completed the wooden box he had started long ago. The box was made of old oak with intricately carved patterns. He brought the box to Daniel. Inside there was no precious item but Daniel's apology letter itself. Jacob said to his brother, "Brother, this box is for holding memories both sad and happy. This letter isn't an apology, but proof of your love. I will keep it so I never forget you." Daniel held the box, his eyes welling up with tears. He had sent that letter as a belated apology, but now it had become a memento, a symbol of forgiveness and love. He understood that Jacob no longer hated him, but had forgiven him, and more importantly, had forgiven himself. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his daily routine. But now his work held a completely different meaning. He no longer felt like an outsider. He had become part of the stories he had helped mend. The loneliness in his heart slowly faded, replaced by a strange joy and happiness. He had found a higher purpose in life, a deeper meaning to his work. One day, Ethan received a special gift. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box with a wooden rose on the lid. Accompanying the box was a letter, but this time the letter had a complete sender's address, Daniel and Jacob. In the letter, Daniel and Jacob expressed their deep gratitude to Ethan. They thanked him for not only bringing them a letter, but also hope, truth, and forgiveness. They said that Ethan was the angel who had reconnected them. Inside the wooden box, Ethan found a blank letter with only a small line of text in the bottom corner, "From our new family." This detail made Ethan's throat tighten. Tears streamed down his face. He had found a family, a place to belong within the very stories he had helped mend. The blank letter had no content, but it held all of Ethan's emotions. It was the promise of a family, a promise he would hold in his heart forever. Ethan stood on the familiar road, holding the blank letter. He smiled. The loneliness in his heart had been filled. He realized that his job was not just to deliver mail, but to deliver hope. Every letter he held with or without an address contained a story and emotion. And he would continue to do his job with a peaceful soul and a strong belief in the power of connection. Ethan's life from a silent observer had become a creator. He had not only helped a family find each other, but had also found himself. He had learned that sometimes, to find the meaning of life, we have to help others find the meaning of theirs. And that was the greatest thing he had learned from the unclaimed letter. The story of Daniel and Jacob had ended, but the story of Ethan, the lonely mail carrier, had just begun. He would continue to walk on the familiar roads, carrying new hopes and stories. And he knew that he was no longer alone.